They called me a stinking hillbilly at my own engagement party venue. And 3 hours later, I fired every single one of them from the hotel I owned. My name is Bethany Burns, and I've spent the last 3 years keeping a secret from my family, while they assumed I was barely scraping by in some cramped city apartment. I was actually building Birch Hospitality, a company that owns 6 boutique hotels across the East Coast. The Monarch Hotel, where my brother Garrett's engagement party was happening tonight, is my flagship property. Every chandelier, every piece of Italian marble, every thread in those expensive curtains belongs to me. But standing in the entrance of my own hotel, wearing jeans and boots that still smelled faintly of the countryside, I looked like exactly what Sloane Whitmore thought I was. Nothing. The woman my brother was marrying had no idea she was insulting the person who could end her perfect night with a single phone call. And honestly, I liked it that way. I'd learned a long time ago that being underestimated is the most powerful weapon you can have. The ballroom was full of people who'd written me off years ago. My mother Patricia, who'd always made it clear I'd never measure up to Garrett. The extended family who'd stopped asking about my life because they assumed there was nothing worth hearing. And Sloane, the perfect bride-to-be with her designer dress and manicured nails, who thought she could say whatever she wanted because I was nobody. She was about to learn a very expensive lesson about assumptions. This is going to be a long story about family, betrayal, and the sweet taste of watching people realize they've made a terrible mistake. If you want to see how this night ended, and trust me, you really do, make sure you're following along here so you don't miss what happened next. The comment about being a stinking hillbilly wasn't even the worst thing Sloane said that night. That came later, when I watched her corner my mother near the dessert table and heard her laughing about how she'd convinced Garrett to keep me at arm's length because my small town energy was embarrassing. I'd arrived at 7, deliberately late, because I wanted to see how the party was running without my interference. Wesley, my general manager, had everything under control. The champagne was flowing, the catering was flawless, and the string quartet I'd personally hired was playing near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Nobody knew I'd chosen every detail of this venue, from the lighting to the flowers. To them, Garrett and Sloane had simply rented a beautiful space. The irony was almost painful. Growing up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, I'd always been the spare part. Garrett was 3 years older, and from the moment I could remember, everything in our house revolved around him. When he made the varsity football team, my parents threw a party. When I got accepted to every college I applied to, my mother reminded me that Garrett had gotten into Penn State, which was more prestigious anyway. It didn't matter that I'd worked twice as hard, studied twice as long, or dreamed twice as big. I was always just Garrett's little sister, the one who couldn't quite measure up. So at 18, I left, packed a single suitcase, took a Greyhound bus to Philadelphia, and decided I'd rather build something from nothing than stay in a place where I'd always be nothing. My mother cried when I left, but I noticed she didn't ask me to stay. Garrett was starting his insurance job, and that's what really mattered to her. Her son was settling down, being responsible, making her proud. I was just running away. The first 2 years in the city were exactly what they imagined. Brutal. I worked as a housekeeper at a boutique hotel, lived in a studio apartment with 2 roommates, and ate instant ramen more nights than I care to remember. But I watched everything. I learned how hotels operated, how guests were treated, what made a property successful. I took online courses in business management and hospitality. I saved every penny I could, invested carefully, and refused to fail. By 25, I was managing that same hotel. By 28, I'd bought my first property, a small bed and breakfast in Vermont that I renovated and flipped for twice what I'd paid. That profit became the down payment on my second property, and that success became the foundation for Birch Hospitality. But I never told them. Not my mother, not Garrett, not anyone from Millbrook. Why would I? They'd never asked how I was doing. Never wondered if I needed help. Never reached out except for obligatory holiday cards. In their minds, I was probably still cleaning hotel rooms and struggling to make rent, and I let them think that because their assumptions gave me freedom. No expectations meant no disappointments. No one looking over my shoulder meant I could build my empire in peace. The invitation to Garrett's engagement party had come 5 weeks ago, forwarded through my mother's email with a note that said they'd be honored if I could make it, though she understood if work made it difficult. The party was at the Monarch Hotel in downtown Philadelphia, she wrote, adding that it was quite expensive, but Sloane's family had insisted on the best. I'd almost laughed out loud. My own mother had no idea she was bragging about my property. That's when I started paying attention to Sloane Whitmore. I did what I always do when someone new enters my orbit: research. Sloane came from old money in Connecticut, the kind of family that summered in the Hamptons and wintered in Aspen. She worked at a marketing firm downtown, though her LinkedIn suggested she did more networking than actual work. Her Instagram was a carefully curated highlight reel of designer labels, exotic vacations, and photos with other women who looked exactly like her. She was everything my family had always wished I could be: polished, connected, acceptable. But there was something off. Small things, details that didn't quite add up. Her job history had gaps. Her apartment, while nice, wasn't in the neighborhood someone with her supposed background would choose. And most interesting, there were no photos with her parents, no mentions of family, nothing that connected her to the old money lineage she claimed. I started making calls. I have resources now, connections in places that matter. And what I found made my blood run cold. 3 days before the engagement party, I received a file from a private investigator I kept on retainer for property acquisitions. Sloane Whitmore wasn't her real name. She'd legally changed it 6 years ago. Before that, she was Stephanie Walsh from Trenton, New Jersey, and she had a record for credit card fraud. Suddenly, Garrett's perfect fiancé looked a lot less perfect. The credit card fraud was just the beginning. Once I had her real name, everything else started falling into place like a nightmare jigsaw puzzle. Stephanie Walsh had been arrested at 23 for running a scam, where she befriended wealthy men, got access to their financial information, and systematically drained their accounts before disappearing. She'd served 18 months and been released on good behavior. 2 years later, she'd legally changed her name, created a fictional backstory, complete with a trust fund that didn't exist, and started working her way through Philadelphia's social scene, looking for her next mark. My brother apparently was it. I spent the week before the engagement party digging deeper, and what I found made me physically sick. Sloane had been dating Garrett for 14 months. During that time, she'd convinced him to add her name to his bank accounts for easier bill paying. She'd suggested he take out a personal loan to invest in a business opportunity that, surprise, surprise, never materialized. She'd even gotten him to put her name on the title of his car, claiming it would help with her insurance rates. Garrett had always been trusting to the point of stupidity. Growing up, he'd been the kid who lent money to friends and never asked for it back, who believed every sob story, who genuinely thought people were as honest as he was. My mother called it having a good heart. I called it being a target, with a sign that said, "Please rob me." According to my investigator, Sloane had already moved approximately $47,000 out of Garrett's accounts into offshore holdings. She'd maxed out 2 credit cards in his name and was in the process of convincing him to refinance his house. Ostensibly, so they could afford a bigger place after the wedding. In reality, she'd walk away with half the equity the moment the divorce papers were filed, which my investigator estimated would happen approximately 6 months after the wedding, right after she'd secured her claim to his assets. The really sick part, this wasn't even about love or companionship for her. It was purely transactional. She had a pattern. She'd done this to at least 3 other men in the past 8 years, each time walking away with enough money to live comfortably for a year or 2 before finding her next victim. One of those men had lost his house. Another had declared bankruptcy. The third had tried to press charges. But by then she'd changed her identity and disappeared. Garrett was just another number in her ledger. I sat in my office at the Monarch the night before the engagement party, staring at a stack of documents that proved every word of Sloane's carefully constructed life was a lie. Bank statements, court records, testimony from previous victims, even screenshots of conversations she'd had with a friend where she joked about how easy it was to manipulate Garrett because he was so desperate to please our mother. That last part hit differently. She knew exactly what buttons to push. She'd figured out that my brother would do anything to be the perfect son, and she was using that against him. She'd realized our mother was the key to the kingdom, so she'd charmed Patricia first, getting her blessing before Garrett even knew what was happening. She'd turned family dinners into opportunities to paint herself as the daughter my mother never had. Everything I'd failed to be, and the worst part, it was working. My mother loved Sloane. She called her regularly, went shopping with her, planned the wedding with more enthusiasm than she'd shown for anything involving me in 20 years. Sloane had given Patricia exactly what she'd always wanted, a daughter who fit the mold, who said the right things, who made her look good to the country club friends. I could have called Garrett right then, could have sent him the file, explained everything, and saved him from making the biggest mistake of his life. But I knew my brother. He wouldn't believe me. He'd think I was jealous, bitter, trying to ruin his happiness because I couldn't stand to see him succeed where I'd failed. Our mother would back him up, probably suggest I was making things up out of spite. Sloane would cry, play the victim, and they'd close ranks against me. No, if I was going to expose her, I needed irrefutable proof presented in a way that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. I needed her to reveal herself in front of witnesses. In a moment where there was no room for doubt, I needed her to feel safe enough to show her true face. That's when I decided to let the engagement party happen, exactly as planned. I'd play my role as the unsuccessful little sister, the embarrassment in jeans and boots, the hillbilly who didn't belong in their polished world. I'd let Sloane feel superior, let her think she'd won. And then, when she was at her most confident, when she thought she'd successfully isolated Garrett from the one person who could see through her facade, I'd pull the thread that unraveled everything. Because here's what Sloane didn't understand about being underestimated. People say things around you they'd never say to someone they respected. They reveal their true selves because they don't think you matter enough to be a threat. They hand you the ammunition to destroy them while laughing at how harmless you are. And I'd been collecting ammunition all week. The engagement party was just the opening act. What came next would destroy more than just Sloane's con. It was going to shatter every comfortable illusion my family had built about who mattered and who didn't. The thing about pretending to be weak is that people will prove exactly how cruel they are when they think there are no consequences. I walked into the Monarch's ballroom at 7:15, fashionably late, deliberately underdressed. My jeans were expensive, but looked worn. My boots were genuine leather, but scuffed in all the right places, and my hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that screamed I hadn't tried. I'd even driven through Millbrook on the way down, letting my truck kick up dust on those country roads so I'd smell like the small town they all wanted to remember me from. Wesley caught my eye from across the room and gave me the subtlest nod. Everything was in place. The hotel's security cameras were recording in high definition. The servers I'd personally briefed were positioned to overhear key conversations. Even the seating chart had been carefully manipulated to put certain people next to each other, creating opportunities for the kind of careless talk that happens when wine flows freely and egos are inflated. My mother saw me first, Patricia Burns Monroe, wearing a dove grey dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, with her hair perfectly styled and her jewelry tastefully understated. She'd remarried 5 years ago to a retired dentist named Richard, and she'd never been happier. The country club, the charity boards, the social standing she'd always craved. Richard's money had bought her the life she'd dreamed of. Garrett's upcoming wedding to someone from old money was just the cherry on top of her perfect life. She spotted me, and her smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered. She crossed the room with that particular walk wealthy women perfect. The one that says, "I'm approaching you out of obligation, not desire." She told me I'd made it, that she wasn't sure I'd be able to get away from work. Her tone suggested she'd hoped I wouldn't. Then she looked me up and down with that expression I'd known my whole life, the one that said I was a disappointment she'd learned to manage. She mentioned I might have wanted to dress up a bit more, given the occasion. She reminded me this was an important night for Garrett. She suggested maybe I could congratulate him and Sloane, and then slip out early if I was uncomfortable, that nobody would blame me for not fitting in with this crowd. Every word was designed to make me feel small, and I let it work, at least on the surface. I mumbled something about this being the best I had, that I'd come straight from checking on a work thing, that I'd try not to embarrass anyone. I watched satisfaction flicker across her face. Good. Let her think she'd put me in my place. Garrett found me next. My brother looked exactly like every other 34-year-old insurance manager in America. Decent suit from a department store. Hair thinning slightly at the crown. Soft around the middle from too many desk hours and not enough gym time. But his smile was genuine when he saw me. And for a second, I remembered why I used to worship him when we were kids. He pulled me into a hug and told me he was glad I came. He said he'd missed me, that we didn't talk enough. He asked how things were going, and I gave him the script I'd prepared. Work was fine, nothing exciting, paying the bills. You know how it is. He nodded sympathetically and mentioned that if I ever needed help, he'd be happy to look at my finances. Maybe give me some advice on budgeting. I almost laughed. My brother, who was being systematically robbed by his fiancée, wanted to give me financial advice. Then Sloane appeared at his elbow, and everything shifted. She was beautiful in that carefully manufactured way that requires serious money and serious effort. Blonde hair with expensive highlights, skin that suggested regular spa treatments, a dress that probably cost what I used to make in 6 months of cleaning hotel rooms. She looked at me the way you'd look at a stain on expensive carpet, something unpleasant that would need to be dealt with eventually. She welcomed me with a voice like honey laced with arsenic. She mentioned she'd heard so much about me from Garrett. She said she hoped I was doing well, despite everything. That last part was deliberate, implying there was an everything I was struggling with. She touched Garrett's arm possessively and suggested they should introduce me to some people. Maybe I'd make connections that could help with my career. I played along. I thanked her, said that would be nice. Shuffled along like the charity case they wanted me to be. I met Sloane's friends, women named Madison and Blair and Kendall, who all looked like they'd been ordered from the same catalog. I shook hands with Garrett's work colleagues, who made that particular face people make when they realize you're not important enough to remember. I stood in corners and made myself invisible while conversations happened around me, and I listened. God, did I listen. I heard Sloane telling someone that she'd convinced Garrett to liquidate his retirement account to invest in a startup opportunity that wouldn't come through for a few months. I heard her mention to one of her friends that she'd already picked out the divorce lawyer she'd use, joking about how she always had an exit strategy. I heard her describe my mother as desperate for grandchildren and easy to manipulate with baby talk. I heard her whisper to Madison about how she'd made sure I got invited just so the family could see how much better she was than Garrett's pathetic sister. Every word was another nail in her coffin, and she hammered them in herself while I stood 3 feet away, dismissed as too irrelevant to notice. But the most important thing I overheard happened around 9 o'clock when Sloane stepped out onto the balcony with someone I didn't recognize. A man, late 40s, expensive suit, the kind of smooth confidence that comes from getting away with things for years. I followed at a distance, standing just inside the doorway where the curtains hid me, but I could hear everything. He called her Steph, and my blood went cold. He asked if this one was finally going to be the big score. She laughed and confirmed Garrett was perfect, predictable, trusting. She told him the wedding was in 4 months, and she'd walk away with at least $200,000 when it was done. He asked if she was sure she wanted to go through with actually marrying the guy. She said it was necessary for the community property claims to stick in Pennsylvania, but she'd already set up the offshore accounts and the divorce attorney who specialized in these situations. This wasn't just a con. It was a business operation with a partner, with infrastructure, with a clear plan that had worked multiple times before. Garrett wasn't just a victim. He was a transaction, and right then, standing in my own hotel, listening to this woman plot to destroy my brother's life, something shifted in me. This wasn't just about Sloane anymore. This was about every person who'd looked at me and decided I didn't matter. Every assumption that being quiet meant being helpless. Every dismissal that had ever made me feel small. They'd all made the same mistake Sloane was making right now. They thought being underestimated meant being weak. Sloane's partner left the balcony first, and I made sure to catch a photo of him with my phone before he disappeared into the crowd. Facial recognition software is a beautiful thing when you own a hotel with state-of-the-art security systems. By the time Sloane came back inside, I already knew his name, Marcus Delaney, a disbarred attorney from New York with a history of financial fraud and money laundering. According to the quick background check my investigator ran that night, he'd served 3 years in federal prison and was currently living in Atlantic City, working as a consultant for various operations that existed in the grey space between legal and criminal. So Sloane had a professional partner. That made sense. The offshore accounts, the carefully timed divorces, the legal paperwork that protected her while destroying her victims. It wasn't amateur work. She'd had help from someone who knew exactly how to navigate the system. I spent the rest of the evening collecting evidence. Every conversation I overheard got recorded on my phone. Every detail Sloane mentioned to her friends got documented. By the time the party wound down around midnight, I had enough material to bury her 10 times over. But here's the thing about revenge. It's not enough to expose someone. If I just handed this evidence to Garrett, if I simply called the police and reported her, Sloane would spin it. She'd cry, claim she was being set up, convince my brother that I was jealous and vindictive. My mother would believe her over me. They'd find a way to explain away the evidence, blame me for causing problems, and Sloane would either talk her way out of it or simply disappear and find a new mark. No, I needed her to confess, in front of witnesses, in a way that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. And I needed my family to see exactly what they'd chosen over me. The next morning, I called a meeting with my attorney, Michael Chen, one of the best corporate lawyers in Philadelphia, and someone who'd been with me since I bought my first property. I laid out everything I knew about Sloan Whitmore, or Stephanie Walsh, or whatever her name was today. Michael listened without interrupting, making notes on his legal pad, his expression growing darker with every detail. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and told me this was criminal fraud, that I needed to take this to the police immediately. I shook my head and explained what I really needed: a way to protect Garrett financially, while giving Sloan enough rope to hang herself publicly. Michael thought for a long moment, then started outlining a plan. First, we'd create a legal trust that would protect Garrett's assets without him knowing. Michael had contacts in estate planning who could restructure Garrett's accounts, property and investments into a protective framework that would make it nearly impossible for Sloan to access anything without multiple levels of authorization. The trick would be doing it without tipping her off or requiring Garrett's immediate cooperation. Second, we'd document everything, every transaction Sloan made, every conversation she had, every move she and Marcus planned. We'd build an ironclad case that wouldn't just expose her fraud. It would make prosecution inevitable. Third, and this was the beautiful part, we'd give her exactly what she wanted. We'd let her think she was winning. We'd create an opportunity for her to make her move, to go for the big score she'd been planning. And when she did, when she committed the fraud in front of witnesses, with irrefutable documentation, we'd have her. But I needed to know why. Why Garrett specifically? Why go through with an actual wedding when she could have just dated him, drained his accounts, and disappeared like she'd done with others? There had to be something I was missing, some piece that would explain why this con was bigger than the others. I spent the next 2 weeks digging deeper into Garrett's finances, and that's when I found it. 6 months ago, our Uncle Harold had died. Harold Burns, my father's older brother, had been a successful commercial real estate developer in Pittsburgh. He'd never married, never had kids, and when he died, he'd left his entire estate to be divided between his 2 nephews, Garrett and me, except nobody had told me. The estate was worth $2 million, and it was sitting in probate court waiting to be distributed. The executor was my mother, who had power of attorney over both inheritances. She'd told Garrett about his share, $600,000, but she'd never mentioned mine. As far as I could tell from the legal documents, she was planning to claim I'd waived my rights to the inheritance, forging my signature on documents that would give my entire share to Garrett. My own mother was stealing from me to give Garrett double the inheritance, probably justifying it as making up for all the help he'd given her over the years. Or maybe just because she'd always liked him better. And Sloan knew. Somehow she'd figured out about the inheritance, realized that Garrett was about to come into significant money, and that's why she'd escalated from girlfriend to fiancé. She wasn't after his salary or his savings. She was after $600,000. Or if my mother's plan worked, $2 million in inheritance money that would be distributed right after the wedding. That's why the timeline was so specific. That's why she was going through with actually marrying him. She needed legal claim to the inheritance money the moment it was distributed, and the only way to guarantee that was to be his wife. I sat in my office staring at those probate documents, feeling something cold and hard settle in my chest. My mother had been willing to commit fraud, to give Garrett money that was legally mine, and Sloan was planning to steal it all from both of them. The cruel irony was perfect. My mother would help steal from me to give to Garrett, and Sloan would steal it from Garrett before he even knew what he'd lost. They'd all destroy each other while fighting over money they'd taken from me in the first place. I could have walked away right then, could have hired lawyers, fought for my inheritance, and let Garrett and my mother deal with Sloane themselves. But that felt too easy, too clean. They'd all made choices that revealed exactly what they thought of me. My mother had decided I didn't deserve my own inheritance. Garrett had never even questioned why I wasn't mentioned, and Sloane had assumed I was too irrelevant to notice or too weak to fight back. They'd all underestimated me, and that was going to cost them everything. Michael asked me what I wanted to do, his pen hovering over his legal pad, waiting for instructions. I looked at those probate documents, at the evidence of betrayal stacked on my desk, at the file full of Sloane's crimes, and I made a decision. I told him we were going to do something they'd never see coming. We were going to let Sloane think she'd won, let her walk right up to the edge of her perfect crime, and then we'd show everyone exactly who'd been playing whom all along. But first, I needed to have a conversation with my mother. And unlike every other conversation we'd had in the last 13 years, this one was going to happen on my terms, in my territory, with my rules, because Patricia Burns Monroe had forgotten something important. The girl she'd dismissed as a failure had grown up to be the woman who owned the ground she was standing on, and it was time to remind her. I invited my mother to lunch at the Monarch's restaurant 3 weeks after the engagement party. I told her I wanted to talk about Garrett's wedding, maybe contribute what I could to the planning. She agreed, probably because she thought it would be a good opportunity to remind me of my place in the family hierarchy. While enjoying a meal she assumed I could barely afford, she arrived exactly on time, dressed in what I'd learned to recognize as her power outfit, tasteful but expensive dress, designer bag that didn't scream but whispered wealth, jewelry that suggested money without being ostentatious. She was playing the role she'd perfected, tasteful matriarch of a successful family, graciously making time for her struggling daughter. Wesley seated her at the best table in the restaurant, the one by the windows with the perfect view of Rittenhouse Square. She ordered a salad and sparkling water, and we made small talk for exactly 4 minutes before I decided to stop playing games. I told her I knew about Uncle Harold's estate. I told her I'd seen the probate documents. I told her I knew she was planning to forge my signature and give my inheritance to Garrett. The color drained from her face. She started to protest, to make excuses, but I kept talking. I laid out every detail I'd discovered, every legal document, every step of her plan. I watched her realize that I wasn't the clueless daughter she remembered. I wasn't the girl who'd left Millbrook at 18 with nothing but wounded pride and desperate hope. She tried the mother card first, telling me I didn't understand, that Garrett needed the money more than I did, that he had a wedding to plan and a house to buy and a future to build. She suggested I'd abandon the family, so why should I expect to benefit from it now? She reminded me that Uncle Harold had loved Garrett, spent time with him. While I'd barely visited after I left home, I let her talk herself into corners, let her reveal exactly how she justified stealing from me. Then I asked her one simple question. Did she actually believe I needed her charity? She blinked, confused, and I saw the moment it started to crack. She looked around the restaurant, really looked at it for the first time. The art on the walls, the quality of the furniture, the quiet efficiency of the staff moving between tables. She noticed Wesley checking in with me subtly, the way the servers called me Miss Burns, the deference in their voices. She asked where we were, what restaurant this was. Her voice had changed, uncertain now, like she was starting to see something that didn't fit her narrative. I told her we were in the Monarch Hotel's restaurant. I told her I owned it. I told her about Birch Hospitality, about the 6 properties I'd built from nothing, about the business I'd created. While she assumed I was struggling to survive, she didn't believe me at first. She laughed, actually laughed, and said I must be confused, that I couldn't possibly own a hotel like this. So I called Wesley over and introduced him as my general manager. I showed her the business cards in my wallet with my name and title. I pulled up the Birch Hospitality website on my phone and showed her my photo in the executive leadership section. I watched her world tilt. Every assumption she'd made about me for 13 years shattered in real time. The daughter she'd pitied, the sister she'd deemed less worthy, the girl she'd stolen from because she thought I'd never know. That person had never existed, except in her imagination. She tried to recover, to spin it as good news, telling me how proud she was, how she'd always known I'd do well eventually. But I cut her off and asked her again about the inheritance. I asked her why she'd decided to steal from me, even though she had no idea whether I needed it or not. I asked her to say out loud what she'd been thinking. And here's what broke her. She admitted she'd done it because Garrett deserved it more. Not because he needed it more, because he deserved it. Because he'd been the good child who stayed close, who called regularly, who made her look good to her friends. Because I'd left. And in her mind, leaving meant I'd forfeited the right to be treated fairly. She'd stolen from me out of spite, dressed up as favoritism. And now she had to say it out loud in a restaurant owned by the daughter she'd dismissed. But that wasn't the weapon I needed. That was just setting the stage. The real revelation came when I asked her if Garrett knew about any of this, if he'd asked her to give him my share, or if she'd done it unilaterally. She got quiet then, defensive, and explained that she'd mentioned to Garrett that I probably wouldn't want my inheritance, that I'd made it clear I didn't consider myself part of the family anymore. She said Garrett had suggested maybe the money could go toward his and Sloane's future, help them get started, give them security. My brother had known. He'd known she was planning to take my inheritance, and he'd been fine with it. More than fine. He'd helped justify it. I felt something shift in my chest, but I kept my voice level when I asked her if she'd vetted Sloane at all, if she knew anything about her fiancé beyond the polished surface. My mother stiffened and told me Sloane was wonderful, from a good family, exactly the kind of woman Garrett needed. She suggested maybe I was jealous, that I couldn't stand to see my brother happy with someone successful. That's when I slid the folder across the table. Inside were copies of everything I'd found about Stephanie Walsh. The arrest record, the previous victims, the name change, the offshore accounts, the partnership with Marcus Delaney. I'd included screenshots of conversations where Sloane discussed her plans for Garrett, financial documents showing the money she'd already stolen, and a detailed timeline of her criminal history. I told my mother to read it, all of it, and then I told her I was giving her a choice. She could take this information to Garrett right now, today, and help him escape before Sloane destroyed him financially and emotionally. Or she could ignore it, dismiss it as lies, and watch her golden boy lose everything in 4 months when he married a professional con artist. But either way, I was done being the convenient villain in their story. Either way, I was filing legal action to reclaim my inheritance. And either way, Sloane Whitmore was going down. The only question was whether my family would go down with her. My mother sat there, with the folder open in front of her, her hands shaking, her face pale. She kept saying it couldn't be true, that this had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. She insisted Sloane was from Connecticut, from old money, that she'd met her parents. I asked her when she'd met them. She couldn't remember a specific instance, just assumed she had, or would. I asked for their names. She couldn't recall. I asked where in Connecticut. She didn't know the town. Every detail Sloane had fed them was vague enough to sound true. without being specific enough to check. And nobody had checked because they'd wanted to believe her. They'd wanted the fantasy of the perfect daughter-in-law from the perfect background. So they'd filled in all the gaps themselves with what they wanted to see. My mother finally looked up at me with tears in her eyes and asked why I was doing this, why I was trying to ruin Garrett's happiness. Even then, faced with irrefutable proof, her instinct was to blame me for the problem instead of the woman who'd created it. That's when I realized the final truth about my family. They would always choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable reality. They would always choose Garrett over me. And most importantly, they would always find a way to make me the villain when things went wrong. But this time, I had something they didn't. Control. The engagement party had been at my hotel. The evidence was documented by my security systems. The investigation was funded by my money. The lawyers working to protect Garrett's assets were paid by me. Every move Sloane had made in the past 2 months had been watched, recorded, and catalogued by resources my family didn't even know existed. They'd all been playing checkers while I was playing chess. And now it was time for checkmate. I told my mother she had 48 hours to talk to Garrett. After that, I was taking everything I knew to the authorities and letting them handle it. The wedding would implode. The scandal would be spectacular. And she could choose whether to be part of the solution or part of the wreckage. She left the restaurant without finishing her salad, clutching that folder like it was contaminated. I watched her go and felt nothing but cold certainty because I'd just learned something crucial. My mother loved her image more than she loved her son, and that meant she'd try to manage this situation quietly. Keep it contained. Prevent public embarrassment. She wouldn't go to the police. She wouldn't make a scene. She'd try to convince Garrett to break it off privately. Maybe offer Sloane money to go away peacefully. And that would give me exactly what I needed. A chance to catch Sloane making her final move in public with witnesses in a way that couldn't be swept under the rug or handled quietly. The wedding was in 4 months at the Monarch Hotel because Sloane had convinced Garrett that the venue where they got engaged was romantic and perfect. She didn't know she'd chosen the one place where I controlled everything from the cameras to the caterers to the officiant. She'd walked into my territory, planned her final con in my building, and assumed I was too irrelevant to matter. In 4 months, she was going to learn exactly how expensive that assumption would be. My mother called Garrett, exactly as I'd predicted. I know because I had coffee with him 2 days later, another meeting I'd orchestrated, and he was rattled in a way I'd never seen before. He told me Mom had said some concerning things about Sloane, that maybe they needed to slow down, reconsider the timeline. But then he'd talked to Sloane, and she'd cried, explained it was probably just pre-wedding jitters, reminded him how much my mother had struggled with Richard's kids, and sometimes projected her anxieties onto others. Sloane had successfully reframed the conversation. My mother's warning became evidence of her own instability, rather than legitimate concern. Garrett admitted he'd checked Sloane's background online, but of course he'd found nothing. Stephanie Walsh's records were sealed. And Sloane Whitmore's digital footprint was expertly constructed. He'd found exactly what she wanted him to find. A perfect life, perfect credentials, perfect history. He asked me what I thought of her, his voice uncertain in a way that broke something in me. This was my chance to warn him, to try one more time to be heard. I told him she seemed nice enough, but relationships were complicated, and maybe he should make sure he really knew someone before marrying them. I kept it vague, non-accusatory, just concerned enough to plant a seed without triggering his defensiveness. He thanked me for caring, but explained that when you know, you know. He loved her, she loved him. Mom was just being overprotective. Everything would be fine. I watched my brother walk away from that conversation still convinced he was marrying the love of his life, and I realized there was no saving him from this. He'd have to learn the hard way, just like I'd learned the hard way, that our family would always choose the comfortable narrative over the painful truth. So I stopped trying to prevent the wedding and focused on making sure it would be memorable. The 4 months between that conversation and the wedding day were the most strategic period of my life. I coordinated with Michael Chen to restructure Garrett's assets into a protective trust that would activate the moment he married Sloane. The legal work was complex, but Michael had connections who specialized in prenuptial protections for people who didn't know they needed them. We created a framework that would make it legally impossible for Sloane to access Garrett's inheritance, retirement accounts, or property without multiple levels of authorization that she'd never be able to fake. I hired 3 different private investigators to track Sloane and Marcus's movements. I learned their patterns, their communications, their plans. Marcus was operating out of Atlantic City, but making regular trips to Philadelphia to meet with Sloane. They had a system. She'd feed him information about Garrett's assets. He'd structure the offshore accounts and prepare the legal documentation for the divorce. And they'd split the proceeds 60-40 in Sloane's favor. I documented everything, every meeting, every transaction, every conversation. I built a case that would be impossible for any prosecutor to dismiss. But the most important piece fell into place 6 weeks before the wedding, when I discovered that Marcus had a grudge. 3 years ago, he'd been caught and prosecuted by a particular assistant district attorney in Philadelphia who'd made his case a priority that ADA Caroline Ross had personally ensured Marcus served the maximum sentence because she'd seen the damage his financial scams had done to his victims. I reached out to Caroline through Michael's connections. I explained what was happening, showed her the evidence I'd gathered, and watched her face transform from professional interest to personal investment. She told me that Marcus Delaney had destroyed at least 15 families that she knew of, and she'd been trying to catch him operating illegally for years. Sloane's operation was exactly the kind of case she needed to put him away for a long time. Caroline became my secret weapon. She couldn't officially investigate until a crime was reported, but she could position herself to respond immediately when it was. And she was more than willing to make sure every resource of the Philadelphia DA's office was ready when the moment came. The wedding day arrived on a perfect Saturday in October. The Monarch's ballroom had been transformed into an elegant ceremony space, all white flowers and candlelight. Every detail orchestrated by Sloane with my family's money. She'd chosen the most expensive package we offered, convinced Garrett to pay for it all up front, and charged another $20,000 to his credit cards for personal wedding expenses. My mother had invited 200 people. Garrett's side of the church included everyone from Millbrook, childhood friends, distant relatives, neighbors who barely knew him but loved the spectacle. Sloane's side was noticeably sparse. She claimed her family was small and intensely private, that most of them couldn't travel for health reasons. In reality, she'd hired actors to play her parents, college friends who were actually partners in previous cons, and filled seats with people who existed only for the day to create the illusion of the life she'd claimed. I sat in the back, wearing a simple grey dress that let me blend into the crowd. Wesley was positioned near the front with the security team, all of them briefed on what was coming. Michael Chen was sitting with the family, officially there as a friend, but really there as my legal backup. And Caroline Ross was standing outside the ballroom in an unmarked car with 2 other detectives, waiting for my signal. The ceremony went exactly as planned. Garrett stood at the altar, looking nervous and proud, while Sloane floated down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars. She'd worked hard for this moment, played her role perfectly for 14 months, and now she was about to achieve what she'd set out to do: legal claim to my brother's assets and my stolen inheritance. The officiant began the ceremony, moving through the traditional words about love and commitment and partnership. Sloane smiled at Garrett like he was her entire world. My mother dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Everyone was playing their parts in the beautiful fiction they'd all bought into. Then, right before the vows, I stood up. The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at me, including Sloane, whose expression flickered from annoyance to concern when she saw my face. I apologized for the interruption and explained I had something important to say before they made their vows. My voice was calm, professional, the tone I used in business negotiations. I told them I wouldn't take long, but this couldn't wait. Garrett started to protest, but I kept talking. I explained that I'd recently learned some information about the bride that he needed to know before legally binding himself to her. I mentioned that I'd tried to share this privately, but circumstances had made that impossible, so I was left with no choice but to speak now. My mother stood up and told me to sit down, that I was making a scene, embarrassing everyone. Sloane's face had gone pale, her carefully constructed composure starting to crack. I ignored my mother and spoke directly to Garrett. I told him his fiancee's real name was Stephanie Walsh. I told him about the credit card fraud conviction, the previous victims, the pattern of relationships designed solely to steal money before disappearing. I told him about Marcus Delaney and the offshore accounts. I told him about the divorce plan that was supposed to happen 6 months after the wedding. The room erupted. Sloane started crying, calling me a liar, insisting this was insane, that I was jealous and vindictive, and trying to ruin her wedding out of spite. She turned to Garrett and begged him to throw me out, to ignore this obvious attempt to destroy their happiness. Garrett looked between us, his face a mixture of confusion and anger. He demanded to know what I was talking about, why I was doing this, what proof I possibly had to make these accusations. That's when I nodded to Wesley. The ballroom's projection screens, the ones Sloane had insisted on having for the reception video montage, lit up with images, bank statements showing the money she'd moved, screenshots of conversations with Marcus about the con, court documents from her fraud conviction, photos of her previous victims, a timeline of her criminal history spanning 8 years, and then, the final piece, security footage from the engagement party, where Sloane could be clearly heard on the balcony, discussing her plans with Marcus, laughing about how easy Garrett was to manipulate, explaining the exact timeline for stealing his inheritance. The silence in that room was absolute. 200 people watched the woman in the wedding dress, revealed as a professional criminal, caught in her own words, unable to deny or explain away the mountain of evidence displayed on those screens. Sloane's composure shattered completely. She turned to Garrett, still trying to salvage the situation, telling him she could explain everything, that it looked worse than it was, that I'd somehow manipulated all of this to frame her. But Garrett wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the screens, at the undeniable proof of who she really was. I watched him process it in real time. Every sweet word she'd ever said, every plan they'd made together, every moment he'd thought was real. All of it a carefully constructed lie. That's when Caroline Ross entered the ballroom with her badge out, flanked by 2 detectives. She announced she was with the Philadelphia District Attorney's Office, and she needed to speak with Stephanie Walsh regarding multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. Sloane tried to run. She actually tried to run in her wedding dress through a ballroom full of witnesses. She didn't make it 10 feet before the detectives caught her. Marcus Delaney was arrested simultaneously at his hotel in Atlantic City. Caroline's office had coordinated with New Jersey authorities, timing the arrest to happen at exactly the same moment, so neither could warn the other. The Monarch's ballroom descended into chaos. Some guests were crying, others were shouting, many were just standing there in shock, trying to process what they'd witnessed. My mother looked like she might faint. Garrett stood at the altar, still in his wedding tux, watching his fiancée being read her rights while surrounded by people who'd come to celebrate what they thought was his happy ending. And me? I stood in the back of the room, watching 13 years of being underestimated finally pay off in the most spectacular way possible. Because that's the thing about being dismissed, about being treated like you don't matter. People forget you're still in the room. They forget you're watching, learning, preparing. They forget that quiet doesn't mean weak, and invisible doesn't mean powerless. Sloane had thought I was irrelevant. My mother had thought I was a failure. Garrett had thought I was someone who could be casually robbed without consequence. They'd all been wrong, and now the entire world knew it. Sloane Whitmore, or Stephanie Walsh, or whatever she wanted to call herself, was charged with 17 counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. Marcus Delaney got hit with federal charges for the money laundering operation they'd been running for almost a decade. Caroline Ross told me later that between my evidence and what they uncovered during the investigation, they estimated Sloane and Marcus had stolen almost $2 million from various victims over the years. My brother's case was just the latest in a long line of calculated cons. The trial took 8 months. I testified, laying out exactly how I'd discovered Sloane's real identity and what she'd planned to do. The defense tried to paint me as a jealous sister with a grudge, but the evidence spoke louder than any narrative they could spin. Garrett testified too, describing how she'd systematically isolated him from anyone who questioned her, how she'd convinced him to make financial decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, but were actually designed to give her access to everything he had. Sloane got 12 years. Marcus got 15. Neither will be eligible for parole for at least 7 years, and when they get out, they'll both be registered financial felons, with restrictions that will make it nearly impossible to operate the same way again. But the legal consequences weren't really the point, not for me anyway. The point was, what happened after? Garrett moved back to Millbrook temporarily, too humiliated to face his colleagues in Philadelphia, too broken to explain to friends how he'd been so thoroughly deceived. He went to therapy, started rebuilding his life, and eventually came to understand that what Sloane had done wasn't a reflection of his stupidity. It was a reflection of her expertise. She'd done this to people smarter, wealthier, and more cautious than him. He'd just been unlucky enough to be in her crosshairs when she was looking for her next target. We talk now occasionally, awkward phone calls, where we try to rebuild a relationship that was broken long before Sloane entered the picture. He apologized for the inheritance situation, explained he'd never really understood what Mom was planning, that he'd trusted her judgment without questioning it. I believe him mostly, because Garrett has always been the kind of person who assumes good intentions and gets blindsided by bad ones. My mother took longer to come around. After the wedding disaster, she tried to spin the narrative, suggesting she'd been suspicious all along, that she'd tried to warn everyone, but nobody listened. I let her have that story in public, but in private, I made sure she understood exactly what had happened. She'd stolen from me because she'd decided I didn't deserve what was mine. She'd enabled Garrett's victimization because she'd wanted to believe in the fantasy more than protect him from reality. And she dismissed me for so long that when I finally had the power to help, she'd lost the right to expect me to do it silently. The inheritance got sorted out, My share of Uncle Harold's estate was rightfully transferred to my accounts, and Garrett kept his portion. The money didn't matter as much as the principal. My mother had to publicly admit she'd tried to steal from me, had to sign legal documents acknowledging her fraud, had to face consequences for treating me as disposable. She visits me now, at the Monarch sometimes, at my other properties when she's traveling. We have lunches where she asks about my business, and I answer politely. She's learned to see me as someone who exists independently of her expectations. It's not forgiveness exactly, but it's something close to resolution. The Monarch Hotel became famous after the wedding incident. We got written up in Philadelphia Magazine as the place where the dramatic con artist takedown happened. Business boomed. I had to hire additional staff to handle the increased bookings from people who wanted to have events in the ballroom where Sloan Whitmore was arrested. Birch Hospitality expanded. I bought 2 more properties in the past year, bringing my total to 8. My board keeps suggesting I should franchise, go national, build an empire. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. The point isn't the size of what I'm building. It's the fact that I built it at all. There's something I never told anyone about that day at the wedding. Something I realized standing in the back of that ballroom, watching everything unfold exactly as I'd planned. I wasn't just exposing Sloan. I wasn't just protecting Garrett. I was proving something to myself that I'd needed to prove since I was 18 years old, and got on that Greyhound bus with nothing but $200 and a refusal to fail. I was proving that being underestimated wasn't a weakness. It was a choice I'd made, a strategy I'd employed, a weapon I'd carefully sharpened until it was sharp enough to cut through every assumption anyone had ever made about me. My family thought I was weak because I was quiet. Sloan thought I was irrelevant because I didn't demand attention. They all made the mistake of confusing invisibility with powerlessness. But here's what I learned, building Birch Hospitality from a housekeeping job and a dream. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones nobody's watching. The ones who observe instead of perform, who plan instead of react, who wait for exactly the right moment to reveal that they were never the person you assumed them to be. I'm not the same girl who left Millbrook at 18. I'm not even the same woman who walked into that engagement party 3 years ago, smelling like country roads and wearing scuffed boots. I'm someone who learned that success isn't about proving yourself to people who've already decided you don't matter. Success is building something so undeniable that their opinions become irrelevant. The Monarch Hotel, where this whole story started, has become my favorite property. Not because it's the most profitable, though it is. Not because it's the most prestigious, though it's that too. But because every time I walk through those doors, I remember the look on Sloan's face when she realized the hillbilly she'd dismissed owned every inch of the floor she was standing on. That memory, more than anything else, reminds me why I do this work, why I built Birch Hospitality, why I kept my success quiet for so long. Not because I was ashamed, but because I understood something my family never did. The best revenge isn't loud. It's patient. It's strategic. It's watching people underestimate you right up until the moment you prove them catastrophically wrong. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, thank you. It's not easy to share the moments that broke you, the betrayals that shaped you, the victories that defined you. But I wanted you to know that being dismissed, being underestimated, being treated as irrelevant, those things don't have to be your ending. They can be your beginning, if you're patient enough and strong enough to turn other people's assumptions into your greatest advantage. I'd love to know where you're listening to this from. Drop a comment telling me your city, your story, how this resonated with you. And if you want to hear more stories about underestimated people who built something impossible, make sure you're subscribed here. because the best stories aren't about people who had everything handed to them. They're about people who had nothing, who were dismissed as nothing, and who built something anyway. That's my story. The hillbilly who owned the hotel where the perfect wedding fell apart. The sister who saved her brother from financial ruin. The daughter who proved that quiet doesn't mean weak, and invisible doesn't mean powerless. And every time I walk through the Monarch's doors, past the spot where Sloane Whitmore was arrested in her wedding dress, I smile, because that moment wasn't just about catching a criminal, or saving my family, or protecting an inheritance. It was about a girl from Millbrook, Pennsylvania, who left home at 18 with $200 and a dream, and who came back 13 years later, owning the most expensive hotel in Philadelphia. They called me a stinking hillbilly. I called myself a CEO, and in the end, only one of those titles mattered.